Welcome to a conversation with Dr. Esther Ramsay-Jones. My name is Emma Smith. I'm the project manager with Age UK Salford, working on empowered conversations. Esther, thank you so much for joining us today.
Hello.
Hello. Esther is a psychotherapist. She teaches in counselling and she lectures in death, dying and bereavement with the Open University. If you've not been to one of these webinars before, a big welcome, a big warm welcome. Half of Wigan is on this webinar today, Esther. So there's no work happening in Wigan right now for the next hour because they're all on this webinar. So Empowered Conversations, if you've not come across us, we deliver communication courses for family caregivers of people with dementia across Greater Manchester. And we also deliver one-to-one support for family caregivers in Salford and Bolton, and that's with Empowered Carers. We've been doing these webinars for over 3 years. Esther was one of our very first ones way back when the pandemic first started. So thank you, Esther, for coming back again, even though you've already done it once and you know it was a terrible experience the first time. So thanks for coming back again. Plan for today is that Esther's going to talk to us. If you have any questions, there's a Q&A at the bottom of your page. So if you can just drop your questions in there. Esther will plan to pick up some of those questions as we go through the conversation today, and then we'll make sure that we've got 10 minutes at the end to pick up any questions that we've not covered. Does that sound okay?
Yep.
Brilliant. Then I think we're going to make a start. So I'm going to hand over to you, Esther, if that's okay.
Well, hello everyone. It's good to be here this afternoon. I'm going to share my screen now and hopefully get some slides up. So let me know if you can't see them. Emma and I practiced earlier and it all seemed to be working fine. So Emma's invited me along here today to talk about grief and its relationship to the experience of dementia. And what I'm going to hopefully be able to do is sort of weave together several different strands, really, one of personal experience, one of professional experience, and one of a theoretical backdrop, partially based on my own PhD research in care homes of people with dementia. So I'm going to try and bring it all together. Probably the other thing to add is that I've worked also in palliative care as a palliative psychotherapist, working with people who are terminally unwell. So, you know, that sort of informs a great deal of my thinking. But when Emma invited me to come and talk to you today, what I realised quite quickly is that the day she'd suggested was the day of my mother's birthday. So this is my mum and me being carried by her, and she died in 2019 following a really short and aggressive struggle with a glioblastoma. So for those of you that don't know, that's a brain tumor, and where the brain tumor was located had really had a severe impact on my mum's speech. So she was an English teacher. One of the things that she valued more than anything else was the ability to be able to articulate her thoughts and feelings. She took great pleasure in all manner of classical literature. So for her, that particular loss, when language began to evade her, was a huge experience of grief. So you know, I thought it was really important, given that we're talking about grief, I think. And one of the ways that we can sort of work through and process grief is to honour the dead. I thought it was really important to honour her today while I'm talking about grief on her birthday. But the other reason why I sort of bring my mum to the fore is two things. One of the things I've learned about working with bereaved families and people living with dementia also is that the experience of anticipatory grief, ambiguous loss, grieving after a person has died, I think it really puts a sharp focus on the value of relationships and the relational field. We, I think, oftentimes begin to recognize just how important someone has been in our lives, the impact they've made on us in terms of the person living with dementia. They might begin to recognize how dependent they might be on other people and have not really been aware of that prior to. So there's something about how important relationships are, I think, when we experience acute pain and the pain of loss. So, that's something to sort of think about. And there are some overlaps, I think, at least my experience of having worked with people with dementia and being with my mum as she became more and more unwell. There was some overlaps with brain cancer and the experience of dementia, in the sense that time took on a very different colour. Mum began to, I think, emotionally recognise us, but misrecognised us in terms of language. I remember her calling my kids the names of her cats, so there were these sorts of, confusions of tongues, if you like. So that's sort of, in a way, situating my personal experience. And also my grandmother died of Alzheimer's many years ago. But I also have worked in care homes and have done research in that area. So I'll go on to talk about that. So the aims really of today is to try and do this thing of weaving, integration, as we might talk about in terms of psychotherapy, to touch a little bit on the philosophical dimension of thinking about death and dying. I'm going to tap into my research and the findings that emerged from conducting a psychoanalytic study of the relational field in dementia care. Think about the different forms of death that I found were being expressed or experienced in the care home, and seeing if there are any sort of links that we can make between the forms of death that emerged thematically in the research and the experience perhaps of informal carers and people with dementia who are outside of institutional care. I'm going to talk a little bit about ambiguous loss, intimacy and dying. What is this idea of intimate dying? Some of you might be aware of the work of Marie de Henneschel, who wrote one of the most beautiful books I've ever read on dying, and within the hospice movement, her book's Intimate Death. So I want to try and think a little bit about that, and then we'll look at some grief models. So it's a lot to try and cover. Have a tendency to go off on a bit of a tangent, so I will try my best to cover all of this. So I suppose I'm just really curious to find out what's brought people here. So if you want to use the chat and let me know whether there's some kind of how grief features in your life, perhaps professionally, or you've come here as an informal carer. I'm just curious, and maybe when we get to questions, before you ask a question, you'd be able to say something a little bit about yourselves. So that's just something to sort of think about while you're listening, what's brought you here today. Okay, so the context that we're in, I think when we're thinking about grief, we see it very often, I think, as a kind of individual response to the loss of someone that we care about or have loved, or that we're in relationship with, and that may well be a difficult relationship. So there's the sort of individual, if you think about it, as a sort of map of concentric circles, the individual might be in the middle. But grief is also relational. It exists within systems. And so there's the grief of the individual, how the family might experience grief around that individual. What kind of, let's say, feeling rules does a family have that either supports or hinders the grieving process? And then beyond that, we have society writ large. And I think it's Docker who talked about this notion of grieving rules. which is, in other words, the kind of socio-cultural discourses that circulate around, is it okay, let's say, for if we think about discourses around gender, as one that's quite easy to go to, is it okay that men are able to express feeling following a loss? So those kind of discourses, which we often don't think about, are also getting into, if you like, our emotional realities and the way we might do grief. So that's just something to bear in mind, I think. And so our context right now, I think, in the UK, many of us are aware of, for example, the consequences of climate change, floods, melting polar ice caps, and so forth. And so, many people now are writing about eco grief. So if you think about the wider context, there is this wider context, perhaps, of a feeling of existential threat around us. That, coupled with the more recent coronavirus pandemic, the very frightening reports of death that we've all lived through, the intermittent lockdowns, and little certainty, has given us a very sort of poignant insight, profound insight into death and dying, grieving, anticipatory grief that many of us will have experienced through that time, and what Pauline Boss calls ambiguous loss. So in other words, we've been living in a state of real uncertainty, okay, or at a wider sort of social level. And if any of you are interested, it's very worth getting hold of, I think, Pauline Boss's most recent book, which is called The Myth of Closure. Now, she termed that phrase, I'm sort of skipping here, she termed that phrase back in the 1970s, and really she was applying that to the kinds of loss that carers of someone who might be living with real psychological, cognitive shifts. So it's a kind of grieving the person that once was, and yet physically that person still is very much alive. So we'll come back to ambiguous loss, but as I'm sure you're well aware, it's very important in terms of the experience of being alongside someone with dementia. So, what's the trouble with death and therefore grief? That, perhaps the pandemic has put these conversations into much sharper focus than they were before. But nonetheless, even now, even within palliative circles, it's still difficult to talk about openly. Clark, a sociologist writing in 2018, actually back then, this is pre-pandemic, talked about us in the West entering a period of death revival in contrast to an earlier period of denial. So historically, we might imagine that in the West, death has been disavowed. It's been very much pushed out of our conscious mind, concealed. My experience, and this may have changed, but being in care homes and working them back in the early 2000s, that you would notice a sort of RIP note on a whiteboard. Suddenly a chair would be empty in the institution, and nobody would really sit for any great time reflecting on the death of the person that was no longer, and symbolized, let's say, by this empty chair. And this is despite the fact that attachments formed among residents, attachments formed between the carer, the formal carer, and the cared for. And so there was something about the value of life, let's say, that couldn't be taken hold of. Okay. Now, even though we might be talking more about death, the charity Dying Matters is an excellent one. If you want more information, we have Green Funerals. There are many green podcasts, grief podcasts being sort of shared with us all. nonetheless, in a way, we still avoid talking about actually dying. And it might be because it's much, much harder to face another human being's decline, their increasing dependency, and the emotional and physical mess of the dying process. So in terms of dementia, even though people can live well and live actively, and I've worked with many people who are living in a very happy way, let's say, despite intermittent anxieties, and who are incredibly well supported, the actual reality is that dementia is a terminal illness, and at some point palliative intervention is likely to be necessary. So if we avoid thinking entirely about death and dying, what might be missing? So from a kind of philosophical perspective, Heidegger, back in, many, many years ago, noted that when we live with the awareness of our endpoint in mind, we also are able to make more authentic choices each day. So what does that mean? That means that if we are aware of the finiteness of time, in other words, every day could be our last day, we are more likely perhaps to make choices that are meaningful. I mean, we can think about that. You can think about it as you listen, like, is that the case, or would you be flooded by anxiety? But these are some of the sort of philosophical questions that come up when we think about death and dying. And Marie de Henshaw, who I talked about before, a clinical psychiatrist working in Parisian hospices, felt that this is exactly what you might do when you're either working with someone that's dying, or if you're able to sort of ponder it, which is incredibly hard for those of us that are in well bodies. But for her to, there was something about focusing on the meaning of living and living with minimal regret. So there are these sort of long historical correlations between finding meaning, if you like, and being aware of the fact that we have limited time. And that's something we might come back to in terms of grief. How do you make meaning also out of the very difficult and painful experience of grief? So I think I've mentioned this really in relationship to dementia. If we begin to be sort of less in denial, perhaps, that dementia is to all intents and purposes of a long-term condition, which is also one that is terminal, we might begin to have some of those trickier conversations earlier on in the disease trajectory, when someone has their cognitive capacities, there are minimal semantic losses. And why would we be having those conversations? Well, really to ensure that as much agency in the person is accessed. In dementia care, I think everyone will be familiar that we talk about personhood and supporting, all of those kind of important aspects of another human being's identity. Well, in order to do that, perhaps there is something about tentatively having conversations around what someone might want for the rest of their time. How might they want to be treated, cared for? And in a sense, what those conversations allowed for, even if we think about notions of advanced care planning, and some of you might be interested in a book called I think it's the Psychodynamic Approaches to Dementia Care. There's a really wonderful chapter in there where one of the practitioners is talking about looking at advanced care planning, not as a sort of an exercise that has to be done, not as a kind of very basic task, but rather as a process that allows the sharing of story. And in that, the sharing of story, we might imagine, may involve grieving aspects of ourselves that are beginning to evade us, or, you know, parts of our role that are no longer possible. So it's an opportunity for the sharing of story, but also I think the sharing of grief. And if I think about the work that I've done in palliative psychotherapy, and certainly in the pandemic, you know, setting up a lot of groups actually to hold the anxiety around grieving and collective grieving, there is something about the importance of sharing and the creation of community in order to face any form of grief, really. So that, you know, and I know Empowered Conversations is doing a lot of work in that area in terms of group formations and creating community. So going to try to think about some of these sort of fundamental notions. So anticipatory grief, I'm imagining people are quite familiar with this notion. So anticipatory grief might belong to both the formal carer, the informal carer, and the person with dementia. So for a person with dementia experiencing anticipatory grief, there might be this sort of sense of mourning oneself in advance. You know, the fear of what is going to become of me. What more am I possibly going to lose? If I think about my mum's experience, although it wasn't dementia, as I've said before, one of the things that she kept anticipating were more words becoming out of reach. And she, you know, and related to that was really the fear that she was no longer going to be an understood human subject. And we might think about that in terms of dementia in a moment. Damasi, writing in 2004, said something along the lines, he was relating this really to people who are in reasonably good health, but our death as individuals is an experience of separation unlike any other experience of mourning. In other words, it is the most profound separation. It is us being disconnected from the world around us, disconnected from those in our relational field, and also disconnecting ourselves from ourselves. It's almost an impossible task to imagine that we're going to be no longer. But what I've often noticed in people who are very unwell, people with dementia, I was speaking to someone with dementia only a couple of weeks ago, and I think one of the things that occurred to me as I was listening was that part of the anticipatory grief for him was also wrapped up in imagining the grief of those he would leave behind. So there is something about grieving, I think, that takes on the imagined grief of those who will be left behind, as well sometimes, I would say, as grieving one's own losses, but grieving sometimes those whom you have lost yourself. So it's not uncommon for people living with dementia, people towards the end of their lives, to also begin to grieve those earlier losses. So that there might be a son that's died, or there might be a mother, and the experience of facing one's own end point almost brings those earlier grieves back into consciousness. I know I'm going off the slides here, I'm afraid. So Kubler-Ross, I'm sure everybody's familiar with her work. So I'm not going to say a great deal about it, other than to say that, number one, I think her model has been sort of set up to be assumed to be this stage-like model. In other words, you know, And the other thing to point out is that this model came about with her work with dying people. So it wasn't a post-physical death model of grief. Initially, she was having many, many conversations as a psychiatrist with people who were dying. What she noticed were these were the sort of emotional thematics that came about in her conversations, if you like. It's not to say that a person faced with, dementia or any other terminal illness initially feels denial, then they feel anger, then there's bargaining, then there's depression, then there's acceptance. Okay, now it's all closed up in a neat little box. That's not really what she was saying. She was saying that these kind of different feelings and responses would be, wave-like almost. We often talk about grief as wave-like, but there are oscillations, there are movements in between these different states. I've got a very tiny note at the end here. Hessler, who worked with Kubler-Ross on this model more recently in 2019, following the death of his own son, has added meaning as a kind of sixth stage. Although I'm sure, again, it's not that it's stage-like, but that there is something that can happen, if the process of grief is worked through the right way of saying it. I'm not so sure, but if grief becomes integrated into our experience, there are possibilities then for finding meaning. So, but we will get to that a little bit further down the line. So in terms of people with dementia, in my work, whether this has been in my work in palliative psychotherapy or within the context of doing research in care homes, I've noticed particular symbols of grief that I've found in people with dementia. Now, this could be the grief of their own experience, in terms of, I was once very able, I once felt very competent, I once had a role, I once had a sense of purpose and belonging, to, grieving all of those things. Is that often I notice that people with dementia might be using another way of telling me that they might be grieving something about themselves. So I remember one woman particularly always used to tell me her hair was fraying, that it was in front of her eyes, she couldn't see anymore. And that was real. But I think she was also telling me that she felt that she was becoming disintegrated, fragmented, she couldn't see things as clearly anymore. And so although it doesn't look like grief as we know it, there's not been a kind of death, we're not in our sort of, our mourning attire and so forth. These are indicators, I think, that someone is grieving an experience of themselves. I remember a few people in care homes telling me in interviews in my research that they'd lost their babies, that they'd left babies on buses, for example. And so these were another sort of indicators of the desperate sort of and painful loss that people might have been going through. So sometimes it was about feeling that they could no longer mother anyone, that they weren't competent to mother anymore, they weren't competent to care for another person, or sometimes that they'd lost parts of themselves that they felt were in need of care. I mean, we're all familiar, I think, with keys, wallets, clothing going missing, and on this, and those objects may well have, I'm sorry about that, I think there's someone at my door. These objects in real terms may be misplaced, but there's also something about saying and communicating lostness and loss. So these are, some of the symbols of grief that we might notice. Now, even in someone that isn't experiencing dementia, and who has lost, let's say, a partner, long-term partner, or a parent, or a child. So someone in who doesn't have dementia at all, it's not uncommon for people to hallucinate in grief, you know, to hear voices of the person that's died, to do what's called object seeking, you know, going around looking for that person who's lost, going back to familiar places. And Meeson, who actually did do, and I'm sure many of you are familiar with his work on attachment theory and applying that to the dementia care landscape. Meeson also noticed in people with dementia that they might call out for those who are missing. And he talked about this idea of the parental fixation. Grief, often there are psychosomatic presentations, you know, heart palpitations, headaches, stomach upset, and of course insomnia, minimal sleep. But particular to the experience of dementia and what we might be grieving, I think people are often grieving on both sides of the coin, whether you're the person with dementia or the carer, the experience of being recognised. So I think that is a hugely important thing to think about in terms of what does grief mean in the field of dementia care. And you know, a really powerful piece of work was done by a man called Tim Dartington, who writes about managing vulnerability in healthcare and social care systems. But his wife, Anna, was a psychotherapist who had very early onset dementia. And she writes an incredibly moving chapter called My Unfaithful Brain that is really well worth looking at. And she talks about this experience of no longer being recognized. And she says, I have even become an outsider in discussions about me. So this relates in some ways, I think, to how we might plan for care. I think, how do we continue to recognize someone who is possibly becoming less recognizable to themselves in terms of the planning of care? And this is Tim's take on it as her husband. The puzzled look of someone who cannot distinguish the familiar face of the other who has lived with them for 40 years or seems to think that her daughter is her mother is a look that strips bare our emotional beliefs about self and other. So there's something here about what goes on dynamically, if you like, when both parties begin to be misrecognized. So I think there's a lot of grieving around the difficulty with kind of mutual recognition. And I think it's not to say that there aren't moments of terribly beautiful recognition in the care of people with dementia. But I think you have to acknowledge just how difficult it is when both parties may at times be feeling misrecognized. So, you know, supportive sort of responses to all of this. How do we sort of know, if you like, what do we do in the face of grieving? And how do we be supportive of agency, really, I think is something about having open conversations that are important. You know, there's ways in terms of daily care practice when we might recognize that someone with dementia is grieving themselves, grieving their identity. We can, you know, sort of those small acts of care, I think, are sort of reassuring to someone who's grieving their identity. So if you think of signatures of appearance as a marker of self. So with my mother, she always wore a clock around her neck. She always wore mascara. So those tiny acts of care, she had the same perfume that she always used. You know, when my dad was looking after her and when the carers, the formal carers began to help with palliative care, people were very attuned to those sort of signatures of appearance that I think, you know, allow someone to continue to exist and to be held in mind. There's something about being held in mind for someone with dementia, I think, as a sort of you know, a fully sentient being still that's really important. How do we do that? Well, some of the things we can do are in those small acts of care. The idea in a way of a living funeral. Now that might sound morbid, I think, but in funerals, what do? We sort of, you know, we have these wonderful, you know, kind of sort of memories that we share about the person that has died. We remember many of their good points, their eccentricities and idiosyncrasies. There's something about how do we, if we're thinking that time is finite, how do we communicate with one another like that each day? You know, so there's something about telling one another, perhaps, something of the good stuff, you know. It's about honoring someone while they're alive, you know, and not waiting perhaps until they're dead, because that can often lead to quite a regretful experience and may indeed complicate one's grief. Okay, so I've mentioned ambiguous loss, and I think this is particularly poignant for informal carers, and I really do recommend going and having a look at the work of Pauline Boss. She's actually on a podcast called Shapes of Grief Talking, which is well worth listening to, and her book The Myth of Closure is a really helpful book also to read, and she situates that actually within the context also of the pandemic. And you know, the difficulty with ambiguous loss is because you can't necessarily see what the loss is. So from the perspective of people outside, let's say a family unit where someone is being cared for with dementia, it might mean that others can't quite tap into or empathize with the extent and intensity of the loss that might be being endured by a carer, because of course there's no physical death. The loss, the experience of ambiguity is around the desperate uncertainty really of what's going to be lost next. What's going to be lost next in the person that I'm looking after? What's going to be lost next relationally between the two of us? Are we ever going to be able to go back to the park again, take a holiday? What does our future look like? And there's a sort of sense of cognitive dissonance about it, because, you know, on one level, you know, the carer is grieving, but perhaps doesn't feel that that grief is even justified, because of course the person still exists. So that ambiguous loss can become quite a disenfranchised experience of grief. You know, people can feel very, very isolated in it, you know, as if to say, well, you know, nobody's died here, so am I even permitted to feel so desperately about this situation? This is from Pauline Boss's work. She sort of says what helps. And so here comes this thing of meaning again. You know, how can you find meaning in all this ambiguity? Now, I think we have to acknowledge the reality of how hard it can be to care day in, day out for someone who is experiencing at times acute anxiety, perhaps, maybe desperate suffering, fear. They may be becoming more withdrawn, but you know, nonetheless, you know, there might be these pockets or these times where you notice a deep sense of connectedness between you. And so there's something about, you know, finding meaning in those small moments. Now, it's interesting, I spoke to someone recently who sort of said to me, well, moments aren't going to be enough, you know. So I think there is something then about, you know, needing to share that and finding other people who may have managed to find a way around some of the difficulties of ambiguous loss. There's something about sharing, I think, and not retreating and withdrawing in the face of ambiguous loss that can make a real difference. So sometimes you have to revise the nature of the relational dynamic and the attachments, which, it might be that the person with dementia was once, the person that arranged all the finances, who did all the cooking. And so all of those revisions have to take place in terms of the nature of the roles that people take up. And that in itself it can be a huge loss, having to come to terms with different aspects of yourself, having to find skills that you perhaps didn't know that you had. The dynamic between a sort of informal carer and someone with dementia might begin to become something a little bit more akin to the relationship between, a parent and a child. Now, that's not to say by any stretch of the imagination that the person with dementia is a child. They simply are not. They have a huge wealth of memory, a huge wealth of experience. Invariably, people have also a really rich source of competency. But the reality is, particularly as the disease progresses, is that someone will become more dependent, as with any terminal illness. So the minute someone becomes more dependent, they are seeking in the other care. So, and that can be a very frightening place, both for the person with dementia, particularly, and we'll come on to this, if their attachments with their own primary caregivers early on in life have been wobbly. It might be very frightening to be dependent on another person. It can be equally frightening for an informal carer to begin to look after someone with dementia, because they may have their own fears about their own dependency. They may also have had caregivers who they looked after. So they might be people who looked after their own parents. And so looking after a partner with dementia might stir up resentments like that they remember from their time growing up. So it's a complex relational field. So this, while we can revise our attachments, it's also quite difficult. And sometimes we might need help to be able to do that. One thing I would say that I think, is worth thinking about is this idea of adjusting mastery. So we might feel that we need to take control over everything, and understandably so. The experience of dementia, for a carer and the person themselves, is one where things will feel out of control sometimes. So a normal sort of instinct is then to try and control everything, get everything sort of neat and tidy. What Boss says is, in the face of ambiguous loss, there is something about loosening one's sort of control on things. It can help with managing the uncertainty. So I think, I will touch on this, and because I think this is really quite difficult for people who are living with ambiguous loss, is to try to discover new hope. Because I think what new hope means is the imagining that there could be a future beyond the current situation. I think that's terribly difficult, because it leaves someone feeling guilty, as if they no longer want the person with dementia to be in existence. But there is something about trying to be open also to an imagined future, because what we know is that one life is likely to go on living. Now, that's terribly difficult, but I think, again, often support from other people to help you to feel less guilty about that, can be invaluable. And the other thing that's often important is to explore ambivalent feeling, because there can be a real tension with ambiguous loss. On one level, of course, you don't want the person you're caring for to be no longer here, but you're also exhausted perhaps at times. You might be irritated, you might have lost your cool from time to time. So there's all of this stuff, but not wanting at the same time that person to no longer be there. But it creates a huge tension in the self, and so exploring those sort of ambivalent feelings, if you like, the fact that you might be resentful on one level, but deeply fond and loving towards someone, it's a tension that's quite hard to reconcile. So those things can help with ambiguous loss. Okay, so I'm going to turn to this care home study and think about whether any of the themes that came up in my research also relate to the experience of dementia and to the grief you might find in an informal carer. So the three themes that came out from my research: one was occupational death. This is what I noticed in observations, psychoanalytic observations, but also in very loosely structured interviews, both with people with dementia and with the staff team there, is that both the person with dementia and the carers often felt as if their roles had sort of gone, So there was something about the sense of being undervalued. A social death was very much in the domain of people with dementia. In other words, they felt, at least within the care home institution at times, that they were overlooked, as if they didn't exist, which in some ways ties up with this notion of occupational death, but it's much more specific. It's much more about, I can no longer enjoy going to the cinema too. I can no longer enjoy and participate in things that I might wanted to have done. And of course, in the care home context, there were, terribly difficult moments where people had died. And one of the women that I observed in the study, who I will call Daphne, and who was living in the care home, her partner actually died when I was doing the observations. And, this was a really tremendously worrying time for her, because her attachment figure external to the care home no longer made visits. And it profoundly affected her. And I think there's a sort of misunderstanding that people with dementia, because perhaps factual reality is a little bit more out of reach, particularly once you might end up living in a care home, let's say, or towards the sort of end stages of dementia. There's a misunderstanding that a bereavement is not felt or understood. Now, it might not be that can be named, but certainly in Daphne's case, and many of the people I've worked with, it's certainly felt. Because if we think about the fact that we have these relational fields which exist both outside but inside our mind, we know that something and someone has gone missing. I don't know where the picture's gone. So this is one of the care staff who talked about her experience of what we might call repetitive mourning. So if you're working in a care home or in a hospice provision, let's say, you get to know the people you're caring for. You often will become incredibly fond of them. You will know these very intimate details, and very often the people who you're caring for are interested in you too. They want to know, if you're a frontline carer, maybe that you've got children and what you're doing with your day. So Sophia said about this experience of sort of becoming attached to people and then having to cope with detachment. She said it's very difficult when we have a resident who gives up and they say, I think it's my time. I'm not doing anything else. I just want to go. I'm tired of living. And she said, it's not a work where we deal with machines, we deal with emotions. And when we deal with the emotions of someone else, we need to deal with the emotions of ourselves, and it's not easy. And sometimes we need a break, a holiday, just to focus on something else, to recover and come back. But if we like what we do, we manage to do it. Now, I think, this is a professional carer talking, but I think we can begin to see some of the links between the experience, perhaps, of being an informal carer too. Emma, how have we got for time?
I was just about to drop you a message. So we've got 8 minutes left.
Oh gosh.
How are we doing on the slides?
Oh, help. This is terrible, isn't it? I tell you what I'll do. Shall I go? What would people like to know about? Would they like to know about grief models, or the experience of being bereaved, living with dementia? What do you think, Emma?
Well, why don't you go through the slide that's on right now, and why don't we open it up for people to drop their questions into the Q&A, and then we'll have 6-7 minutes of questions.
Okay, so this is just an example of Daphne. So she was in the care home and her partner died. He'd visited twice weekly, and his funeral had been mentioned to Daphne, as I observed it, as the day out. So it wasn't explicitly said. She thought she was going out, maybe for a coffee, maybe a visit to a park. But what was so, sort of palpable in the way she was holding her body is that she basically was walking around endlessly in the home. And she said, their worlds don't understand my world doesn't understand theirs. She begins to make a quivering, anxious noise again, holding her hands together tightly around her. You imagine Daphne's falling apart inside. She begins to stare at an empty chair while Celia is getting one woman ready. They are too busy. They can't. Now, there's a lot of debate, I think, about whether we explicitly mention to someone with dementia that another person within their attachment system has died or not. So it's a constant question. I think the question we have to ask ourselves is, what's getting in the way of us being able to say, for instance, to Daphne, I can see you're in a lot of difficulty now. Can you tell me what's going on? We don't want to open the conversation, perhaps, because we fear that someone might be reliving a death as of new, or that what we might say might stir someone up again. So there's something constantly, I think, whether you're an informal carer or a professional carer, is who is containing you if you are going to receive the overwhelming grief of someone with dementia. So this is an example of an experience of palliative psychotherapy, working with someone with dementia. And the family had been very fearful. The man had lost his wife, been very fearful about mentioning mum or his wife, but she was everywhere. She was in the empty chair. She became the lamp in his home. And it was a really sort of tentative teasing out, if you like, of where he was at. So the work was really about gently saying, is she here with us today in this room? And I think once he began, as you can see from this, I think I made an intervention where he'd been talking about the light being half lit up, and the life became symbolic of his wife. And really all I had to say is, we're thinking about her today, aren't we? And it allowed him to begin to say how much he missed his wife, but also for the son that was in the room to come in and share that grief with him. So if I'm to go right to the end of all these slides that we haven't really got to, but nonetheless, I think, and I'll give these slides to Emma so people can have them. I want to sort of leave with a quote from Sigmund Freud, who whose daughter died in the Spanish flu pandemic. Now, in the Western world, I think we've often thought that what we have to do when we're grieving is separate from the dead person and sort of come to an acceptance and sort of sever links. But Freud, when his daughter died, realized that actually there's a sense of the continuation of a relationship. So he said, when we know that the acute sorrow we feel after such a loss will run its course, but also that we will remain inconsolable and will never find a substitute, no matter what may come to take its place, even should it fill that place completely, it remains something else. And that is how it should be. It is the only way of perpetuating a love that we do not want to abandon. So I think the thing to think about with grief is that there is no one way to grief. Most psychological models are quite neat and tidy, but there is something about oscillation and movement in grief that's helpful. That there's no one way to grieve, that community makes a difference. Ritual and honoring, remembering the dead makes a difference. Moving the body. Very often grief gets located in the body. It weighs us down. It makes us heavy. So walking, dancing, any mode of physical expression, particularly in the immediacy of a physical death, can help. Being in nature. Nature is transient. There are shoots of beginning in among the evidence of ending. So even many people I work with, when they're grieving, feeling, absolutely bereft, they take some comfort in just noticing the sort of impermanence of nature, writing and feeling. So these are all sort of aspects of how we might support one another in terms of our grief. And I think to end on a hopeful note, but without sort of diminishing the real, relentlessness that some people can experience in grief, is that really grief is a teacher in some ways. I think it teaches us very profoundly about relationship. It makes us very consciously aware of the sort of nuances of relationship and how another person has informed our own life. It tells us about where we may have made mistakes, but we've got to be compassionate with ourselves and forgiving in the making of those mistakes. I think it can be hugely transformative. Sometimes we notice, particularly in partnerships, that in grief, a partner will begin to reclaim parts of themselves that they've located in the partner. So there might have been a dynamic where they thought, their husband or their wife was better at ironing, or, better at being intellectual, and they find those skills in themselves. So it can be hugely transformative. And I think, from a societal perspective, I think our own personal grief can open us up to the wider grief of the world around us. So it can sensitize us to the fragilities that are in the world around us. And I mean, I'm ever optimistic that grief can be a way into community. I think I'll stop there.
Thank you, Esther. You're right stopping the share of your screen?
Yes, sure.
And we've come in at exactly 2:30. Thank you so much for that. We've got someone who's not very keen at all on the term informal carer.
Okay.
So there's nothing about being a carer that's informal. It's 24/7, 365 days unpaid. It's a thankless job.
Yeah. I mean, I suppose in academic circles, we use that without thinking about it. So, thank you for sort of alerting me to that. I'm well aware of, the absolute relentlessness of work, looking after someone, day in, day out, overnight, being woken up, at all manner of hours. So, it's a really important point to make. Yeah,
thank you so much for having the courage to make it. It's not easy, is it?
Absolutely.
when you were talking about ambiguous loss, I was thinking about empowered conversations, and a lot of that comes through. And I never gave it that term, but that's what we're seeing as people are talking about, you know, husbands, wives, mothers, dads. So thank you so much for that. That talk was really, really helpful for me. Thank you for your time. Everyone's been very quiet. There's not good for us though, Esther, because there was no time for a question. So, like they already knew they weren't going to get a question in.
Oh dear. I'm so sorry everyone for that.
No, don't be sorry. Don't be sorry. It was really, really informative, and it's really helpful. Thank you so much for your time today. I really appreciate it. Thank you everyone for coming along today. If you enjoyed today's talk, we've got another webinar on the 9th of November with a lady called Daphne Franks, who will be talking about her experience of predatory marriage. So that's a really interesting talk. If you can make time for that. I know Esther's going to make time and come along for that one.
That sounds brilliant.
And then, you get lots of nice comments coming in now. I can listen to Esther all day. So interesting. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Really kind.
Lots of thank yous. Wonderful. I'm going to finish it now because we've run over a little bit and I don't want to take any more of your time, Esther. So thank you so much. Be in touch soon and take care.
Take good care. Bye-bye now.
Bye-bye.